A lot of people have asked me if there is a quick and easy way of becoming a full-stack web developer. My answer is yes, and I'll reveal all the secrets in this video. A lot of people spend time and money learning about the wrong topics that won't help them in the interview stage or won't help them to get that job. There's just so much material out there with different frameworks, different tools and different languages and different courses and different tutorials that it becomes really overwhelming to know what you need to learn to land your first job as a full-stack web developer. And yes, that first job is the most important. Once you get that first job, everything else becomes a lot easier. So in this video, I'll show you exactly what you should be learning and what you should be avoiding to land that first job in the shortest possible time. So the first question you might have is what language you should start off with. My normal answer to that for any developer is see which one works for you and see which one doesn't work for you, and go with the one which you find most comfortable. In this specific case, where you want to become a full-stack web developer in the shortest possible time, I think there is only one language that comes out on top, and that's JavaScript. JavaScript has been the most popular language for 9 years running, which makes it a really good language for developers, and it makes it easier to get your first job since there'll be lots of different JavaScript jobs out there in the market. But I think the more important reason to use JavaScript is because it can be used in the front end through frameworks like React and Vue and Next.js, but also in the backend where it's equally as popular in NodeJS. So you can learn one single language and work across the stack instead of having to learn JavaScript for the front end and something like Python or Java for the back end. There is a little catch here that for any front end development, you will also have to learn HTML and CSS. But this is true regardless of any language that you use. So in total, we have 3 languages, the main one being JavaScript and HTML and CSS being for mainly like styling and creating the page. As I said before, there's a lot of material out there and you will get lost if you don't know what you're doing. I will list the exact topics and projects that is just enough to get your first role, because I think once you get the first role, it becomes a lot easier to know what you're doing, what you want to do in the future, and you're also earning while you're learning. So before we get into the languages themselves, I want to talk more about the environment and what are the things you will need before you start coding. So first of all, your editor. Now, lots of people will have preferences for the editors, but I prefer VS Code, and I strongly recommend VS Code if you're starting off developing too. It's very simple, it's got a very simple interface, it's not got lots of bells and whistles, it's very bare bones, and that makes it perfect for concentrating on writing code and understanding the code that you write. It's also got really good Git integration. I personally use Git through VS Code, and I really don't need to touch the terminal at all. Another good thing about VS Code is it has really good JavaScript support. The other thing I mentioned was Git. Remember, you want to get your first job as soon as possible, so don't spend too much time learning the ins and outs of Git. Just get comfortable using basic Git for your projects. So the first language you should start off with from HTML, CSS and JavaScript is HTML. HTML is all about elements, and there are a few elements that you need to learn and get quite familiar with. So the first group of elements are all about the structure of HTML. This includes the head, body, title, nav, header and footer, and that will give you a good idea of how a HTML page is defined and the structure involved in an HTML page. The next group of HTML elements are more towards the content, so this will be things like the heading tags, paragraph, anchor, the image tags, list, span and div tags. Just understand what they do and where they might be used. Next, need to move on to forms. It's how users feed back information or feedback to the website developers and the website owners. So you want to get familiar with the form tag, and inside of the form tag, the input, checkboxes, labels, select and submit. Then you want to get really familiar with the button tag. These are used across all websites, everywhere. So be pretty comfortable with these. Then lastly, you want to get familiar with the table tag. And this includes how to add header columns and rows and how to add the normal columns and rows. Don't get too into the table itself and designing the table. Just understand how to just get a normal, maybe like a 5x5 table. Now CSS is a bit of a weird one for full-stack developers and probably any developers. It's a language which people tend to just learn by trial and error and don't really develop a full fundamental understanding of it. I think As a beginner looking to get a full stack developer job as soon as possible, you don't need to understand what happens behind the box in CSS. You'll just be wasting your time. Again, just learn what you need to get your first job. So the first thing you want to do is learn how CSS is applied in HTML. So this would include inline styles and through classes. And in classes, you want to learn how to add multiple classes for a single element. Then you want to move on to CSS selectors. Now there are a lot of CSS selectors out there. You only need to learn about a few of them, which will be type, universal, class, ID, and pseudoclass selectors. And again, there are a ton of pseudoclass selectors, but I will say just get familiar with the hover and focus pseudoclass selectors, and that should be enough to understand where pseudoclass selectors are generally used. And for the actual content itself, you want to learn about the box model. Now the box model is quite fundamental to CSS, so learn exactly what it does and why it's used in CSS. That includes the padding, the margin, and the border. Then you want to learn about sizing, so that will be in pixels, percentage, rem, and viewports. Just learn the different units here. You don't need to learn the exact conversion. You can use Google for that in your job, and you will never be asked that in an interview. Then you want to understand changing actual text. So this will be font sizes, font family, and text colors. Then learn about how to position different elements using flexbox, using grid, or using relative and absolute positioning. These three methods are the most commonly used to position different content in your HTML page, so get very familiar with these. And the last topic you want to learn in CSS is media queries. Modern websites are all about responsive design so that they work with a desktop and with a mobile phone, and so media queries are quite important to get your head around. There are some general front-end topics which I couldn't put in either HTML or CSS, so I'll mention them right now. So you want to get familiar with the DOM. This is the Document Object Model. Understand what it means and why it's used, and then also understand how the browser renders HTML and CSS. This will give you a good understanding of generally how a browser works and how HTML and CSS is used together to display what you see in a website. And the third topic is more of a developer tool, so you want to get very familiar with the Chrome developer tool and understand how that's showing you HTML and CSS and how you can manipulate HTML and CSS directly in the browser. Getting very familiar with the Chrome developer tool is quite important because you'll be spending a lot of time wondering why some of your CSS and HTML is not working as it should, and you'll need the Chrome developer tool to figure that out and what you can do to improve your code. Now we move on to the third language. Now this one's quite a chunky one because there's a lot of topics in JavaScript. I've saved you the hassle and filtered it down to the topics that you need to get your first job in the shortest possible time. So first, start off with the syntax of JavaScript. So this would be declarations and variables, including let, var, and const, and when to use each one. If statements in JavaScript, while loops in JavaScript, and for loops in JavaScript. And with for loops, you want to understand the three different ways of doing a for loop. The first one is through indexing, second is a for off, and the third is for in. Lastly, for the syntax, you want to get very familiar with try and catch statements. Next, we move on to data types. Strings are used all over the place in any language, and JavaScript is the same. So get familiar with how to get the length of a string, how to replace some text in a string, what template strings are, so that you can insert JavaScript variables into strings, and learn how to add strings together, which is called concatenation. Get familiar with objects, so where they are used and why they are used, including how to access a certain field in a JavaScript object. There are multiple ways of doing that, but get familiar with destructuring, because that's used all over the place, and using a normal dot field notation. You also want to get familiar with looping through the keys and fields in an object, using object.keys, object.entries, and object.values. This is a bit more modern JavaScript, but is used extensively all over the place, so it's good to get familiar with those. The other data types that you should get familiar with are the Boolean, the number, and in number, learn about the parseInt and toString methods. Arrays in JavaScript, you'll come across these all over the place, so get familiar with the map and filter methods for arrays, how to get the length of an array, find the element or index in an array, push an element onto the array, so add elements into the array, splice an array, so split up an array into two different or multiple different arrays, and the spread notation for arrays as well. Next are floating points, null and undefined, type conversion in JavaScript, double and triple equality signs in JavaScript. This would be quite closely linked with the type conversion you learned before, and dates in JavaScript. Next are functions. Get familiar writing functions through the old way and the new way using arrows, declaring and calling functions, parameters including default parameters, what a function's scope is and what a global scope is. Then you want to move on to asynchronous JavaScript. Again, this topic can get quite complicated, so you want to stick with the basics. So learn about async and await syntax, promises, callbacks, and then and catch. Then learn about modules, so how you can spread your code across different files. This includes name and default exports, the require and import syntax, and how the package.json and lock.json are used for installing dependencies. JavaScript does have classes, but I haven't seen classes used in JavaScript code even for really large code bases. So just know that they exist and get a very high level overview of when you might want to use JavaScript classes. Then going back to the DOM, you want to understand how to do some simple manipulations of the DOM using JavaScript. Again, because we have frameworks like React, Vue, and Next.js, you'll probably not be manipulating the DOM directly using JavaScript, but it's still something that you should understand that you can actually do. So learn the basics, including removing and adding an element in the DOM, changing classes of an element, changing the attribute of an element, and getting an element by ID. This will give you a good understanding of what is possible using JavaScript to manipulate the DOM. So there are other topics which you need to cover in JavaScript. This includes getting a basic background understanding of how a Node.js engine differs from a browser engine. Don't get too deep into this, just get a very high level overview. Then understand what REST APIs are. So know all the different types of methods in a REST API and understand and know the basic status codes. Then get familiar with the fetch API on the browser. So how to call an endpoint or API through JavaScript, how to pass the JSON response, and dealing with errors returned by APIs. If you've never used any of these languages before and you don't really have a clue where to start, do some tutorials and crash courses on the different topics that I mentioned above. But I strongly recommend, as soon as you get a basic understanding of all the topics I mentioned before, start your own project. Doing your own project really tests your own understanding of the different topics and really helps you focus on things which you don't understand instead of just regurgitating things which you already understand and already know quite well. So move on to your own project as soon as possible. So I mentioned doing your own project. Now what should that project be? So any project that you do should demonstrate your knowledge of all the topics above. You really don't need to make it complex. I would strongly avoid doing that. Don't use any server-side rendering, any serverless architecture, authentication, or focus on SEO. There's no need for that. You just want to demonstrate your knowledge of the topics that I mentioned above and nothing else. The other thing you need to do is make it easy to run and visually decent, because that's the first thing that someone will see when they come into your project. How do I run this project and what does it look like? If you don't have an idea of your own, I would strongly recommend doing a to-do list website. So this would basically allow a user to input a task in a list and for that list to persist even after a refresh or the user clearing their cache. And the technologies I recommend to use for this project, I would suggest not doing a plain HTML, CSS, and JavaScript frontend, but using React instead. It will require a bit of learning at the beginning, but it will speed up the process massively, and it's a very popular framework. And for the backend, just use a simple NodeJS server with Express APIs. Express is quite simple to use and very popular for APIs. I would recommend going for a popular database. So this would be things like Mongo, DynamoDB, or SQL. And this is because the technologies will have good community support. So any questions you may have will probably be answered by people before you, which makes it a lot easier and a lot quicker to develop and get started as a developer. For the project, I know I said to make it visually attractive, but just remember, you're not a designer. You want to become a developer, so just make it visually decent and don't go out of your way making really complicated stylings and CSS. So once you've created your project and you've demonstrated all the topics above, push your project onto GitHub. If you don't have a GitHub account already, then definitely make one. And for the project, make sure you have a really good README which outlines simple steps on how to get your project running for anyone who's reading your code. Make sure to link the GitHub repo in your CV so that anyone that's reading your CV can quickly go on the repo and check your code out. And so doing your own project will help demonstrate your knowledge without you having to tell the interviewer or someone looking at your CV that you know about these different topics. Your code will do the talking, and it also becomes a really good focus point for discussions in interviews, and you'll feel very comfortable discussing what you've done and the different choices you've made in your code. So that's all for this video on how to become a full stack web developer in the shortest possible time. If you liked this video and it was helpful to you, please share it with your friends and colleagues and leave a like and subscribe to this channel. If you have questions or suggestions related to this video, please leave a comment down below and I will happily reply to your comments. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.